From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
On behalf of the Hispanic Division, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this lecture. I want to thank Thalia Guzman Gonzalez, our Luso-Brazilian specialist, for organizing this event. And now I'm delighted to introduce you to our researcher, Mariana Joffily. Professor Joffily holds a postdoctorate degree from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, Brazil. She has an undergraduate and PhD degree from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and a master's degree from the University of Paris, La Sorbonne. Professor Joffily is a CAPES and Fulbright scholar. She's a professor of the postgraduate program in history and the Department of History at the State University of Santa Catarina, Florianopolis, Santa Catarina, Brazil. And in 2008, she was a lecturer in the history department of the State University of Santa Catarina. She's also taught history courses at both the State University and the Federal University of Santa Catarina. And she has authored two books, both of which the Library of Congress holds, and a variety of articles, all related to her areas of research. And she's received numerous grants, honors, and fellowships. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Joffily.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking the Hispanic Division for the opportunity to be here in the person of Georgette Dorn and also in the person of Carlos. And I would like to thank also the extremely kind and professional staff of the Hispanic Division. And particularly, I'd like to thank Thalia, who not only invited me to give this talk, but also pushed me to do so. And of course, I want to thank each one of you who took the time to come here today, and I'm very honored with your presence. Mário Quintana, who was an extremely graceful Brazilian poet, once said, I quote, "The past doesn't know its place. It's always present." I'd like to start by reflecting on the importance that the Brazilian military dictatorship has in the present, and I will mention a very recent event. As you know, the Brazilian House of Representatives voted last month for the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. One deputy, Jair Bolsonaro, whose political career has been devoted to the most conservative causes, dedicated his vote to the commander of a torture agency, where some decades ago, the president, a former guerrilla fighter, was detained and tortured. This astonishing declaration outraged many sectors of the Brazilian society and produced a massive wave of denunciation before the Federal Prosecutor Office. It was an isolated manifestation, as were the public demonstrations of a group of people that went to the streets advocating for a military regime to solve the ongoing Brazilian political crisis. It gives, however, a sense of the presence in the public debate of the sensible subject of the military dictatorship. The National Truth Commission, created by Rousseff in 2012 in order to investigate the human rights violations that took place during the military rule, also exposed the presence of this past that insists on being present. The recommendations of the Truth Commission leave no doubts that even though the country has been living under a democratic regime since the middle of the 80s, there are some significant legacies left by the dictatorship, among others the national security law, the militarization of the police, and the spread of torture in police stations. It is about this past that we are still trying to overcome that I want to talk today. How to interpret hundreds of political interrogations? That was the main challenge I faced when I started the research for my PhD dissertation that became this book. At the time, my ambition was to understand the logic governing political torture during the Brazilian military dictatorship that took place from 1964 to 1985. I was less interested in the perspective of the victims, although naturally it was taken into account, than in the perpetrators. They didn't document the methods of torture they applied, nor did they explain why they considered it an irreplaceable instrument in the fight against communism or subversion. Yet, for professional purposes, they did register in a very methodic way the interrogations of political prisoners, which were often conducted with the use of torture. The political interrogations I had in hand represented an invaluable resource. Since the 60s, Brazilian military officers had been in contact with the French theories on revolutionary war developed during the independence wars in Indochina and Algeria. They were also familiar with the U.S. doctrine of national security, formulated in the context of the Cold War, as well as with the counterinsurgency methods used in the Vietnam War. Both placed information at the heart of the struggle against the internal enemy, be it the ones who fought for independence in a colonized country, the communists, or even people demanding profound social and economical changes, the so-called subversives. Interrogations were the core of political repression and represent, in a certain way, a condensed view of the struggle between the repression and the political dissidents. But they are tricky documents to analyze. I soon realized that in them it was as much about giving information as hiding it behind silence, lies, and diversions, both from the interrogators and for the detainees. As one historian puts it, documents from the political police mask as much as they reveal. It was particularly troubling to find out that the interrogations did not contain the questions or the interrogators' names. Reading them, I had much more the impression of being immersed in the left-wing militants' universe than in the interrogators, as for the most part, the interrogations were accounts of the detainees and their comrades' actions. The feeling I had at the time was that I was looking at what the document's finger was pointing at, when what I actually wanted to understand was what was behind that finger. A valuable methodological strategy to reach the universe of the repressive agents, beyond reading between the lines, was to consider the transcription of the interrogations not as an accurate record of the detainees' words, but as a conscious act that had to be taken into account. A social psychologist has a precise way of describing this. He claims that public documents are, I quote, simultaneously features of the social action and the social action itself. Therefore, even though the only thing we can have access to is the document, the record of the action, we need to keep in mind that it has this double dimension. It is evidence of the action that generated it and the expression of how that action was documented. The military government, when it was impossible to deny the existence of torture, utilized multiple times the argument of occasional excesses or of cruelty of specific individuals. The same explanation was offered by the U.S. Embassy, as we can now read in the documents recently released by the U.S. authorities to the Brazilian Truth Commission. As the U.S. supported the military coup, provided military and police training, and was very close to the Brazilian government, when the news about the use of torture spread abroad, the U.S. Embassy explained it in terms of isolated cases. Nevertheless, during the Brazilian military dictatorship, torture was a system. The link between interrogations and torture was established, unsurprisingly, by the victims. Yet, reading the interrogations, we can observe that the sessions happen any time of the day or of the night, that they happen even in military hospitals, and that sometimes they were interrupted due to the detainees' health conditions. Despite the level of mobilization of the social movements in the 60s, when the military took power, they did not face any real resistance. Many authors point out that most clandestine left-wing organizations, particularly the ones that preached guerrilla tactics as their main strategy, were created to compensate the lack of immediate response. Right after the coup in 1964, there was a first wave of repression with a massive number of arrests, sometimes followed by torture, removals from office, and interventions in unions and public agencies. However, the accounts of a more directed and sophisticated violence did not arise until the military rule hardened, with the Institutional Act No. 5, dictated in 1968, that opened the doors to a much more structured and radical political repression. The act concentrated so much power in the executive's hands that some scholars consider it a coup inside the coup. The formation of military agencies specialized in political persecution with a corpus of specialists trained in interrogation methods, including torture, started in 1969. Obviously, torture existed in Brazil long before the military rule, and the country had experienced a dictatorship under Getúlio Vargas that was very harsh on political activists. During the military dictatorship, however, a repressive apparatus was built by the armed forces that, until then, hadn't been involved in political repression. As some clandestine left-wing groups started to organize actions against the military dictatorship, the army created the Operação Bandeirantes in São Paulo in 1969 as an experiment. It assembled agents from the different police and military forces, specializing itself in persecuting political dissidents and centralizing the efforts in political repression. The operation was effective in obtaining information about how some of the left-wing organizations operated and in destroying some of their bases. Considered a huge success, in 1970 it was institutionalized by two new agencies: the Detachment of Information Operation, whose acronym DOI means it hurts, responsible for the arrests, the interrogations, and the analysis of the collected information, and the Center of Operation on Internal Defense, CODI, responsible for coordinating the operations. The two together, known as DOI-CODI, were spread to the capitals of the main Brazilian states. The DOI-CODI system was created from secret directives elaborated by the National Security Council and approved by the president himself. The functioning of these agencies was based on the dichotomy legality-illegality, which gave them dynamism and flexibility. With regard to its foundations, the DOI-CODI was anchored in the solid structure of the army with full support of the upper ranks. The methods employed, torture, home invasion, kidnapping, disappearance, murder, were illegal even within the logic of authoritarian legislation erected by military dictatorship. Although used with the consent of the hierarchy, it was not publicly admitted because of the damage that it caused to the image of military and government forces. The solid logistical support, combined with the implicit permission to act clandestinely, and therefore without accountability, enabled the agency to enjoy great freedom of action. The interrogations were produced thus by repressive agencies that combine both the expertise of the civil police in the arts of questioning and the discipline of the military under the command of the latter. The combination of skills was made, however, under a mutual prejudice. For the civil police, the military lacked experience in a field that they had worked in for many years, weren't prepared to perform investigations, and possessed little finesse or political sensitivity. The military, in turn, considered the police in general to be corrupt, incompetent, dishonest, and lazy. The army made use of police officers to take advantage of their accumulated expertise, but also to avoid employing large amounts of military personnel in an attempt to minimize damaging their image due to the involvement of the institution with internal security. The framework of the cooperation between the security forces and the military was well defined. The police officers bore the costs of the numerical and symbolic burden of the methods employed by the agency. The military was in charge of the decision-making and commanding the operations. It is worth mentioning that when some of the former military officers from Doikodi gave their testimony at the Truth Commission 2 or 3 years ago, they said that it was only the civil police that employed torture. Over time, the conditions they work under contributed to establishing a favorable climate for the creation of a team spirit in the Doikodi, at Grandma's House, as the Doi of São Paulo was called by its members. Safety standards required the use of civilian clothes and forbade military haircuts, even for the officers. The operations and activities were carried out in complete secrecy, and the use of nicknames was required. When someone was suspected of subversive activities, he or she was arrested and interrogated under torture. Once the agents of the DOI were convinced that they had extracted all the information they could have, the detainee was sent to another repressive agency responsible for the formal criminal prosecution. There, an official interrogation was made, and it had to match the previously obtained information. The interrogations could happen anytime, day or night. They could last minutes or hours and produce one unique sentence, something like, declares that had said everything, not having anything else to declare, or few pages and pages. The information contained in the detainee's statements had at least 3 distinct purposes. The first and most urgent consisted in locating the enemy. It was about knowing the militants' identities, scheduled rendezvous, and the location of their hideouts, the places where materials and documents of the organization were kept, where the planning of future actions was made, meetings were held, and militants were housed. Using this information, other militants were located, maintaining a chain of false arrests and allowing the seizure of all sorts of materials, propaganda, weapons, ammunition, money, and internal documents. The second objective was related to knowing the enemy, aiming at foreseeing their next steps and intercepting their activities. The interrogators often inquired about the organization's structure, the functions associated with each position, the strategies employed to obtain funds and weapons, and how and by whom the actions were planned. The third goal concerned legal punishment. It was important to assess how much the opponents were involved with political activities, how strong their conviction was, laying the basis for the judiciary stage of the political repression performed by military justice. The interrogators sought to distinguish between the useful innocent and the fanatics. Adirfilza de Castro, former commander of the COD of Rio de Janeiro, describes these categories as follows. The first were the petits bourgeois offspring of a rich dad whom, when leaving prison, the parents try to remove from the organization, and they allow it. The second time, the coldest were, according to him, very well structured, very resentful, and only thought about their return, the payback. When released, they returned to their terrorist group. The first category was considered recoverable. The second was not. Political crime, in the view of the repression, was different from common crime in at least two ways. It was much more disruptive to the society, as the main goal was to reverse the social structure, and it was usually committed by people with high formal or political education. The statement is based on a very interesting case I found of a suspected drug dealer that was turned over to the Operação Bandeirante because when the police searched his home, they found a letter that seemed to contain coded information, and because the suspect had, in quotes, subversive books. So the suspicion of subversion was more alarming than that of drug trafficking. Another curious case is that of a man that was dating a young lady. Her mother did not approve of the relationship because the man was divorced. She denounced him repeatedly to the police, but as he was released every time, she tried to denounce him as a subversive, knowing that it was an accusation much more difficult to get rid of. What constituted a challenge to the military rule was that the intelligence community was not fighting against the usual targets of the police forces, poor people, Afro-descendants, migrants, but against the well-educated sons and daughters of the middle and sometimes upper classes. Torture, commonly used as a form of social control, most often by the police, affecting the lower classes, extended this time its scope to the political arena. For torture to be used as a recurring method, it is necessary to dehumanize the target, creating a sense of otherness that makes the interrogator, when confronting his victim, lose his usual reactions towards other human beings. When regarding individuals from the most disadvantaged classes, the process that creates a point of view that does not recognize the other as an equal comes from a long tradition of social exclusion whose roots can be found in the institution of slavery and the extermination of native people. Not surprisingly, currently, most of the victims of police torture and executions by the police are Afro-descendants. When it comes to individuals belonging to the higher social strata, students, professionals, religious, military, the marginalization was achieved by the construction of the subject as a subversive and a terrorist, the enemy of the nation, the family, and the Western and Christian values. The danger attributed to this subject seems to be the key to understanding what brought down the immunity of the middle class to torture in Brazil. The class allegiance in this case was broken by the fact that individuals who enjoyed privileged social conditions were turning against what should be their own class interests. In these circumstances, the tacit agreement between the middle class and the elite of the Brazilian society to work together to promote social restraint against the disadvantaged sectors was broken by these individuals who decided to fight alongside the dispossessed in an attempt to subvert the established power system. Despite of the conditions of detainment, the dramatic conditions of detainment and torture, there was resistance. The strategies of each individual before the violence of the interrogators varied greatly, depending on the situation and the degree of physical and psychological resistance of the political prisoner. Some militants say that it was important to build a story and stick to it, which was extremely hard as they were teams of intelligence analysts that studied the interrogations and compared its transcriptions day by day. It was important to remember the details of the story told in order to hide sensitive information. Dilma Rousseff, who was imprisoned and tortured by the Joy-Cody, described how this perfidious game was played. I quote, "The game is never to reveal to the interrogator what you think. He cannot know that you think, and he can never think that you only talk after being beaten. Never. You better not let him acknowledge that he takes information from you by torture. You need to have a story. The bad thing is when your story collapses for any reason. If he thinks that you lied, you lost it. He found out what the game is." End of quote. Unfortunately, it was not just about keeping a solid story. The less the interrogators knew, the greater the possibilities to fool them. Inversely, the more information they accumulated from different sources, the harder it was to create an explanation they would believe. Examination of the interrogations give a glimpse of some of the strategies the interrogators found themselves confronted with. Some examples are, I quote from the interrogations, "Rectifying in parts his previous statements, the detainee clarifies that he omitted many facts in order to avoid snitching elements he had met and until then were not pointed out in previous statements." The next example is about a political detainee that I had later the pleasure to meet in person. He was in possession of the keys and knew the position of the apartment where one of the most wanted left-wing leaders at the time was hiding. He didn't say anything until the day when the interrogators found out by another detainee that he was entrusted with this task. Asked why he had not said anything, he answered simply, "Because I was not asked about it." The last example is a quote from a note written by the interrogators themselves after having confronted two detainees. I quote, "Note, in the face of the absurd negatives by the deponent, this interrogation team wants to make clear that this element is insolent, incoherent, cynical, and untruthful, and that even in the face of evidence as to the facts concerning him, denies them with the greatest cynicism and effrontery." End of quote. The comments of the interrogators exposed their only weakness, the fact that even under torture, sometimes the detainee refused to collaborate, keeping from them the information they wanted so badly. In those cases, the violence of torture was not, in quotes, useful, boiling down to pure cruelty, and in a scenario that was supposed to be extremely favorable to the interrogators, their defeat was immense. A conservative Brazilian bishop once said, I quote, "You don't get confessions giving out chocolate candy." Yet I claim that the use of torture was not exclusively about extracting useful information. I came across situations where the person was not even able to talk because of the torture he had suffered. In a different case, the commander asked his subordinates to gag the detainee during an interrogation because his screams were being heard in the neighborhood. There are also complaints about the use of violence without any questions being asked. One interesting piece of evidence regarding this is that we often read in what were supposed to be faithful descriptions of the detainees' declarations expressions typically used by the repressive agents that are recognizably different from the vocabulary of the militants. There is, for example, an interrogation where a student of medicine belonging to the Communist Party that had taken care of a guerrilla fighter is reported to have said that the help he gave to the, and I quote, infamous terrorist. Well, it's hard to believe that he would have employed such terms to talk about a comrade. It is not just about using certain expressions as the interrogator's logic was sometimes itself appropriated by the detainee. We cannot assert whether it was a strategy to escape torture or an expression of sincere regret. I found some interesting cases, as I quote, "I acknowledge having been a fool for keeping the material without knowing what it was," or, I quote, "declared that was totally deluded by his friend," or, even more striking, I paraphrase, stated that he was glad to have been arrested now because otherwise he could have committed further to the movement. Many detainees denounced that they were forced to sign confessions whose content comprised elements they had not expressed. Regardless to the efficacy of torture as a means to force people to talk, its use was not officially recognized by the government, creating a flagrant ambiguity between the glorification of the military government and its sordid practice of law enforcement. Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, the commander of DOI of São Paulo, the one recently celebrated by the deputies' vote for the impeachment, published 2 books about the DOI Code and made an inflammatory speech when forced to attend to the Truth Commission. He never, not even once, recognized publicly that the agency he ruled employed torture. This dichotomy between discourse and practice extended the omnipotence of the interrogators both by hiding an action that did not need to be accountable to society and by the complicity created between the repressive agents and their superiors in maintaining illegality. A journalist wrote that torture was a piece of the political game rather than an investigative tool. He's right in the sense that its use was the result of a political choice and not an act of individuals. Nonetheless, being considered a quick and effective means of investigation, the interrogation under torture was adopted as the main method of identifying activities labeled as political crimes. This choice was not an innovation, having deep roots in the inquisitorial practices of the Brazilian police, based on the confession extracted by force from suspected criminals. This technique produced quick results with low financial cost, although in the long term it presents a very high moral and political price. The investigative paradigm that employs torture as its main tool carries a paradox. While it should be about investigating facts, it helps to generate fanciful versions, because the collection of information in this context is inseparable from the submission of the victim. The detainee under torture might say anything to escape the pain, be it the truth or what he or she supposes the interrogators want to hear. The perverse aspect of the situation lies in the fact that, to some extent, the burden of denouncing someone, who will probably also be tortured, is carried by the detainee for not being able to endure, although it is a result of the brutal means used by the interrogators. The logic established by the interrogators protects them of all accountability. If the detainee does not speak, he deserves to be beaten to reveal what he knows. If he provides the information, he is a traitor to his own ideology. The aspect of submission is repeatedly mentioned in the denunciations made by political prisoners at the military justice trials. In one of those accounts, a militant explained, I paraphrase, that in the DOI he has undergone such treatment that his psychological resilience to deny the facts that they wanted to impute him was reduced to nothing. A similar statement was made by a sympathizer of a left-wing organization. I quote, "She read the mentioned statement and disagreed entirely with its content. If she signed it, it was because she was emotionally depressed and thereby would have signed even her death sentence." The question that arises when employing torture beyond all moral objections is that there is no identifiable demarcation line between the refusal to provide information and the actual impossibility of doing so. Thus, we enter the sphere of extralegal punishment, where not only do the interrogators anticipate a possible penalty as they elevate it from deprivation of liberty to violation of the detainee's physical and psychological integrity. The punishment function of the torture explains how the transmission of information is sometimes obstructed or frustrated by the very physical abuse, and also why some political prisoners declare having been tortured without even being asked about their activities. To counteract a possible future release by the military justice, which was conservative but more legalist, for lack of legal proofs, the punishment was often granted by the doicode. Moreover, beyond the direct victims of torture, the effects of such violence were addressed to the society as a whole in another function of torture, to inhibit political participation, particularly political dissidents. Inside the intelligence community, the justification for the use of coercive methods was based on its efficacy and on a perpetual transfer of the moral burden to the left-wing militants. Indeed, when we read the depositions that repressive agents gave to the Truth Commission or their published interviews, we quickly observe how their discourse is always built on a reaction to what they consider to be a serious threat. They do not feel they bear responsibility since they were responding to an external menace. The use of torture went, as we see, far beyond the collection of information. It served multiple purposes: to terrorize all those who could possibly consider joining or even helping the left-wing organizations, to destroy the clandestine organizations, to punish the left-wing activists, to make the detainees change their mind by affirming through extremely violent methods the political perspective of the military dictatorship. Though the military authorities repeatedly claimed they were acting in defense of liberty and democracy, the society they dreamed of was conservative, ordered, and authoritarian. A society where each individual should limit him or herself to his or her assigned role. The student should worry about his studies and career, women should take care of their families, workers should work, priests should pray. The social and economical boundaries should be respected, and the political matters should be taken care of by the elite. I want to conclude by quoting Henry Shue, a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. Debating the classic ticking bomb hypothetical case, the one in which there is a ticking bomb in a school full of children, and the only way to prevent a huge disaster is to make the one who knows the bomb's placement confess its location. Shue argues about the impossibility to improvise torture, even to save lives. I quote, "Successful torturers must avoid sympathy and empathy, or they will go too easy. But they must also avoid anger and cruelty, or they will go too hard and merely knock the victim senseless or drive him into a dissociative state and learn nothing useful for the prevention of catastrophe. Torture is not for amateurs. Successful torturers need to be real pros, and no one becomes a pro overnight. At a minimum, one must practice, perhaps do research, be mentored by the still more experienced. In short, torture needs a bureaucracy with apprentices and experts of the kind that torture, in fact, always has. Torquemada was not an independent consultant. Torture is an institution." End of quote. What I wanted to show you here today was a glimpse of how the bureaucracy Henry Shue talks about was constituted and how it operated. The Brazilian military rule established torture as a state policy, what required infrastructure, training, logistics, experts, and legal protection. In the transition to democracy, the Amnesty Law of 1979 granted impunity for tortures and for their superiors. In 2010, the Supreme Court reaffirmed this impunity, rejecting the Order of Attorneys of Brazil's request to interpret the amnesty law from the perspective of the Constitution. We as a society pay a high cost for these choices, for impunity is an obstacle to the punishment of state agents that nowadays torture suspects from the dispossessed classes. And I finish quoting Maria Quintana once more, that said, "We live in the fear of the future, but it's the past that runs over and kills us." Thanks for your attention.
Questions, so jump in.
I want to thank you because I think it's a great speech and have really touched me because we think that we live in a first world and that we have the rights in our hands, and that's not true. We are really living under the fears that the rights are not, have no voice. And I want to thank you, your voice, and also ask you if you think that all these voices, your voice, by example, you are not playing with the problem. You are not going to have problems, to say the truth.
Well, I hope not. Well, we live under a democracy regime that elected a president who was imprisoned and tortured. So if she can be a president, I don't think why I should be in jail for saying what I say. So it's true that sometimes we are a little bit concerned when working with this kind of topic because there are some individuals that are still there, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but recently military that said many things about the repressive system in Brazil, he was murdered, and no one explained how and why, and it's unexplained. But I don't think that it's that dangerous. I hope.
Life is a dungeon.
Yeah, that's it. So, yeah, I'd rather do the things you believe in and live a free life, yeah.
I'd like to thank you as well. This is really great that you're bringing your story here, especially here. And linking to it a little bit what she's saying about the danger of doing these things, I would like to ask you if you're doing any relationship to where those trainings are coming from, to Brazil, Latin America as a whole, and if you are, I don't know if everybody's familiar, but can I? With the School of the Americas back in the 60s, I guess 50s as well, that was located in Panama, and now it's here in Georgia. It still has been training military tactics, territory tactics in Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, and we still have people there. Brazil still have people there, and many other countries. I think there are just 5 of Latin American countries that have people there. So if you are doing this relationship, this connection between the U.S. training the dictators, the torturers, how do you feel then with the possible danger being here? Because it's still a problem. It still exists.
Well, thanks for your question. You raised a very good point. Well, I have no fear, maybe because I'm too naive to think that they are really, looking for people as me. But This research was about the interrogations, and I couldn't find anything related to the U.S. in this research. And now I'm here as a Fulbright scholar and researching on the U.S. relationship with the military dictatorships in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina regarding the human rights violations. And it's really hard to find documents on the military training. Actually, I asked officially to the National Archives and Records Administration, and they answered that they have nothing about it, which I kind of doubt. And they said that probably in the Army's archives they could find something, but they are much more restricted, to access. And I'm working with a colleague, a French colleague, on another research, so that's the third one, about the trajectories, professional trajectories of repressive agents in Brazil. And we are observing these, that they had many different kinds of training in the U.S., from the School of Americas, from Fort Benning, for many places inside the U.S. too, not only in Panama. But it's much harder to find, documental proof and to know exactly what they were being taught and how important was this training, because. Of course, we have to think about the U.S. role, but we also have to take into account the experience we had before, and not just as Brazilians, but Argentinians and Chileans and Uruguayans in torture and things for that matter, and know that it was a kind of, not a coincidence, but they went to the same point from different places. And so we have to take into account the military training given by the U.S., but also that we have some expertise by ourselves, and so not make the U.S. like the big responsible for everything. You have to balance it. But I think it's really important, and I think that is the U.S. played an important role building and giving advice to this kind, to DINA in Chile, to DOICOD in Brazil. We know that some of the U.S. consuls went frequently to the DOICOD, and they knew everything. When we read the documents sent by the U.S. government to the Brazilian Truth Commission, we know that the embassy was informed about many things. They were able to read the interrogations. So they knew when someone disappeared and the family was searching for someone, they already knew that this person had been killed under torture. So it's a responsibility to bear.
I want to thank you for giving such an illuminating talk. I still don't understand the connection between the Truth Commission and what's happening today with the instability in Brazil. Could you clarify that?
Okay, great question. The Truth Commission in Brazil was created very late. If you compare with the other countries that had a dictatorship, so it started its work in 2012. And it was very difficult to the Dilma government to build these consensus on this Truth Commission. And the military were really reluctant to accept it. So I would say that the Truth Commission, among other things, for example, having in schools materials about LGBT education, and the economic policies, and that tried a little bit to distribute the wealth, the Brazilian wealth, and not concentrate it so much. So many things contributed to give these to the right-wing groups and parties this willingness to take the work party from the government for now and for once, because they are really angry about all this politics. And the Truth Commission, I would say that is a part of it, but it's not, maybe not the main element, but it's one of them.
Thanks for your presentation, Mariana. I have a question that stems from, well, you started out talking about the bureaucracy that's needed to have a state that tortures, and you have state policy for torture. And I'm fascinated by the documents you used and how you looked at them and what you took from them. And I'm wondering if you were able to see anything about, in the bureaucracy, those that were being sort of apprenticed and trained for this sort of role that were underachievers. That's a perverse way to look at it. But those that rose to the top and those that didn't. Do you see that in what you were able to look at in sort of the selection of those that would do that role?
Actually, I'm working on this right now in this new research, because with these interrogations, I didn't really have access to the hierarchy, and that was the main concern of the Truth Commission, to know who was above the perpetrators, and to establish exactly who was responsible for what. And so it's really recent to have access to these informations. And I'm trying to understand with Maud Cheriot how these people were selected, in which basis, which were the criteria, and how much time they spend on each organ, and if there was a logic from going to another agency, to one agency to another, if there is some recognizable paths and things like that. So I hope I will have something to tell you quickly.
Another question. I read somewhere that the torture is not efficient to have information. Why is always existing?
Because actually it is. I mean, they worked a lot on. I tried to explain that it goes beyond information, but not to say that the information was not important. It was vital, because for the repressive agencies, of course, because they were able to. Having many interrogations from many people, so they were able to compare different statements day by day, and compare them with other people's statements, interrogations, and compare that with the findings they could perform in these hideouts. So an important part of this information collecting is that you put information together to see what really stands and it's a lie. So it works, sort of, but also because it works, but also because it's a way to impose a certain way of seeing things. So you don't do that to, you don't do that with former politicians that are in jail because they are corrupt. We don't do that with, so I don't know, maybe someone very new in sports and an athlete that made something wrong and was in jail. You don't do that to regular people. You do that against people. So it's not just about information. You do that against people that you want to massacre. Really.
Or systems that you want to destroy.
Yes.
Guerrilla system, and also just it's just part of the artillery of a repressive government.
Exactly. It's a weapon, and very useful.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for giving this amazing presentation. So currently, I'm reading a book named
Mm-hmm.
has the English name 4 Days in September.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
and Gabeira, a former guerrilla. In his book, I read some scholars describe like a sense of conciliatory and a tendency for closure, because although he includes some description of being tortured, he never like accused the dictator in Brazil. So this kind of position, this kind of comments from former guerrilla towards dictatorship, do you have anything, what do you think of that?
Well, there are many different perspectives. So we have former prisoners who built institutions, memorial institutions, and that try to keep this past present in a way that to teach people, to teach the Brazilian society that it's not a good thing to have a dictatorship. And you have those, as Gabeira, that, okay, it's over. It was something in the time, back in the time, and let's think, let's look to the other sides. And well, I would say that it's not the perspective I like the most, because I think he changed his mind about the guerrilla itself. So it's the way he thinks about the dictatorship is related to the way he reflects on the guerrilla now. So, and one thing that was very important, all these 60 and 70 years, they were important to, I think, to banish the idea of revolution of our societies. And it was very, very strong and very effective to that. So today, when you think in revolution, it doesn't make sense. It's something that maybe it was fancy, I don't know, in the 70s, but not now. It's something that has been really banished of our perspective of possibilities. And I think he's a part of it. Like he really changed his mind, and he has a completely different perspective, political perspective today, currently.
Thank you, Mariana, for the talk, and thank you for
Thank
coming.
you.
If you completed the survey, I would love to have that.
So thank you, everyone.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.